Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We will like to give you a formal welcome. Today we'll have our lethal bronzing presentation. And at this time, I would like to welcome the organizer, Sergio Cáceres, co-owner with ABB Tree Service. And welcome, Sergio. It's all yours. Let me ask for you to join us. And there you are. Thank you. Welcome, everybody.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sergio Cáceres, co-owner of ABB Tree Service. I'm an ISA certified arborist and LNO certified pest control operator. I would like to introduce Dr. Brian Bader from University of Florida. He's an insect vector ecologist. Good morning, Brian. How you doing?
Morning, Sergio. Doing good, thanks.
Can you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. My name is Brian Bader. Originally, I'm from Delaware. I grew up there, and I obtained my bachelor's degree in entomology. And after getting my bachelor's, I pursued my master's and PhD, all in entomology. So that's what I'm technically an entomologist, but during my PhD and postdoc training, I got involved with plant pathology, specifically insect vectors in agricultural systems. In Washington and California, I worked in viruses in grapes, and then I moved to Florida in 2016 to work on lethal bronzing disease and identifying and managing the vector.
Perfect. So the first time that I hear from lethal bronzing was back in 2014. I was taking classes in University of Florida, Pest Management University. And the first time when they started talking about it, I said to myself, I see this before. I see it every day when I'm driving on the highways. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the goal of this webinar is information. We're trying to show all the managers, all these people working on the highways, how this disease look like, how they can control or they can help to control this disease, and hopefully we can get to a solution, because basically we're in a dead spot. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the disease, Dr. Brian. What kind of disease it is, and how it becomes such a big issue in Florida?
Well, lethal bronzing is a phytoplasma infection in palms, and basically phytoplasmas are a type of bacteria, but they can't survive outside of their hosts like other true bacteria. So because of that, they need to spread by way of an insect vector, where they're kind of housed within the host tissue, whether the bug or the palm. And the disease was first found in Florida around 2006. And generally, there's usually a lag between when a pathogen is introduced into a new area and when it really starts becoming evident. So 2006 was when it first became evident on around the Tampa area, but likely it was introduced at least a year before that, if not longer. So exactly when it got introduced, we don't know 100%, but the first time it really was noticeable was 2006. And from there, it has spread throughout most of the state. And a couple of things have attributed to its rapid spread, both in time, or excuse me, both in space throughout the state, but also it appears to be picking up pace. And part of that is there's a high density of susceptible hosts in the state of Florida. There's a lot of palm trees throughout the state, both naturally occurring. Our cabbage palm, the state tree, is present in a lot of natural areas, but it's also a common ornamental. But then a lot of the more high value ornamentals planted in nurseries create this kind of ideal habitat for a pathogen to get introduced. In any ag system, when you have a monoculture of a high density of susceptible hosts, it's kind of disease is inevitable, pretty much. So that kind of has been a contributing factor. And then with the amount of traffic going up and down the state, that's an easy avenue for the insect to move and carry the pathogen even further. So it's just kind of been the perfect storm for this disease.
Perfect. You mentioned that our state tree, the cabbage palm, is susceptible, obviously, to lethal bronzing. Do you have an idea the impact that this could have on Florida landscape? We're talking a palm that is everywhere. We're talking a palm that is native, so it grows natural in Florida. And we're talking about a disease that is pretty spreading everywhere and killing thousands of table palms right now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any kind of idea of the impact that this might have on Florida's landscape?
It's, it can drastically alter it, that's for sure, because we saw with lethal yellowing in the past where, I mean, not to date myself, but that was before my time, way before my time. But from what I've been told and some of the pictures I've seen, there was a lot of really tall coconut palms in the Miami area. And after lethal yellowing went through, it wiped them out to where now, from what I've been told, that the landscape down there looks very different than what it did in the 60s and 70s because of the impact that LY had on Jamaica tall coconuts. There's no reason to think that it won't have the same effect now, just with Phoenix palms and cabbage palms in our current, and that's focusing mostly on the urban landscape, though.
Perfect. So you mentioned that it's a phytoplasma disease. Correct me if I'm wrong. That means that the pathogen lost the cell wall. So means that it's lost the ability to survive outside the host. This is important for me as a tree service company owner, because that means that we cannot spread the disease with our pruning tools. Am I correct, doctor?
Yes, that's correct. Because of the nature of the phytoplasma, over the evolutionary time, it has lost its cell wall, but also a lot of genes that are needed to produce certain elements that it needs to survive. So now it cannot survive outside of the host tissue, meaning that it won't spread mechanically for two reasons. It's not going to survive typically long enough to be moved to an adjacent palm, but because it's limited to a very specific tissue type, the phloem or the sap, the ability of it to invade that tissue in a new host is probably not, it's not gonna happen. So it's
perfect.
Transmission by mechanical pruning is not a risk for phytoplasma.
Perfect. Good news for us.
Yes.
Doctor, let's talk a little bit about the vector, this plant hopper that is basically spreading the disease.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about that?
So the insect vector the common name is the American palm succeed. The scientific name is Haplaxis crudus. And this is a very widespread and abundant species. And up until recently, we thought that it was a native species in Florida, and that the introduction of LY and lethal bronzing was just bringing populations of Haplaxis crudus from elsewhere, which is what happened. But we just have evidence that the predominant genotype of the vector in the state of Florida matches populations from Jamaica. And we looked in the historical records, and Hyplaxis crudis was absent from Florida in the early 1900s. Then around the time when lethal yellowing showed up is when we started finding it in the collections. So we suspect that Hyplaxis crudis was introduced from Jamaica, brought LY with it, and has spread throughout the state. Then again in 2005, more or less, is when a population from somewhere where lethal bronzing already was, whether it was Mexico or Texas, or maybe some other island in the Caribbean that has lethal bronzing, they just didn't know. We think that population got brought in somehow to Florida, and that's what caused the current outbreak of lethal bronzing.
Perfect. So, so the plan right now is kind of lower the population of this vector. That's why your research is based right now?
Correct. Early on, you know, when I was getting familiar with this system, I focused more on the phytoplasma and the current management strategies, which have been based around preventative injections with OTC, as well as an aggressive testing and tree removal program, which if both are done responsibly and aggressively, can kind of keep our heads above water and maybe get ahead of it a little bit. But it's, you know, removing sick palms and treating with OTC is not a long-term sustainable option for this disease. It's, you know, those are our kind of our tools right now. But the way I see it is most of the disease spread is occurring in the nurseries. So my focus is now becoming more on vector population control in the palm nurseries. So we get there's less palms in the nurseries that are getting shipped out into the urban environment. And then also fewer insects moving along with those plants that can cause secondary outbreaks along the highways and in parks, in business parks, wherever they're going. And that in time, by managing spread by way of vector control in the nurseries, that will trickle into the urban setting as well. That's where I see the biggest bang for my buck, so to speak. But any options we develop in the nursery with a little bit of modification and tweaking, I think can be applied by landscape companies in the urban environment to obtain some degree of management there as well.
So you mentioned that basically we should remove the palms, infected palms, as soon as possible and inject OTC as a prevention treatment. How often do you recommend injections of OTC to keep the palms healthy?
So right now, the label rate for OTC, I think, is fine, with one modification to where I think every time an injection is done, it has to be in a new location. And it can be done quarterly. And I think that is going to be adequate for prevention of infection with lethal bronzing in most cases. It's not 100% guaranteed from some of the conversations I've had with people, but it gets into some of the physics of injecting over and over and over again into a palm. At some point, even if you're injecting into new locations each time, if you inject in a spot that's connected to an area that you've already damaged before, your uptake isn't going to be that good. So long term, OTC is going to have diminishing returns on an individual palm. But for right now, for the short term, the label rate of quarterly injections with OTC in a new site each time is effective to some extent. So we're sticking with that for the time being, and we're trying to do some studies on OTC to see if we can improve that.
So when you're talking about improving, we're talking about the active ingredient of OTC per injection. That might be a fact.
By improving, I'm somewhat interested in trying to cure a palm once it's infected. I don't know if that's going to be possible. I'm trying to get some funding to do those experiments to see if we can develop a mechanism to inject enough OTC quickly enough to eradicate an infection, or if that's even possible. That we don't know that.
So that's perfect. So let me try to explain my point. We're located on Central Florida, right? I see this every day while I'm driving the highways, and we just finished a project on the Florida Keys. It's 122 miles of palms. We did pruning, injections, and removals. We basically removed around between 19 and 20 palms. Right here on just in one interchange of I-4 and 192, I counted like more than 50 palms in just one interchange. Why so wild spread over here in Central Florida, and why is it spreading so fast? Do you have an answer for this?
So I think it's a couple factors that contribute to the rapid spread and the spread you're seeing up that way. It was introduced around the Tampa area, so it was kind of introduced in Central Florida. So that's going to be the epicenter of the outbreak. However, along a lot of the major roadways as well, like I said, there's Phoenix palms and cabbage palms are a common plant that are planted along the highway systems and in parks. They're one of the most popular ornamentals in throughout the state. So that has kind of created like an all-you-can-eat buffet. There's no shortage of those palms down here in South Florida, but because the pathogen wasn't introduced here, it's not as prevalent as it is up north. Now, it has been spreading further and further south, and I think once it gets fairly well established in Miami-Dade County, because there's a high number of palms down here and a high diversity, this pathogen will start jumping into new palm hosts, and it will probably get it'll probably continue being bad in Central Florida, but I see it potentially getting a lot worse in South Florida as it gets more established down here.
Talking about susceptible palms, do we know which palms are most susceptible? Based on my experience, I know that day palms, like Sylvester palms, they die right away. Once you start seeing the signs, they die in 1 or 2 months. Yeah. Same thing is happening right now with sable palms. When sometimes I can see Bismarck palms, they kind of slow on the reaction to the disease. So do we know which ones are more susceptible to lethal bronzing, Doctor?
From the data we have, it looks like the Phoenix palms and cabbage palms are the most susceptible. Now, we don't know for sure if that's vector feeding preference, if it just likes those palms more, so they're more exposed to it. I have some observational data on something like Chinese fan palms that would indicate that that species is less susceptible than Phoenix palms and cabbage palms. But now that we know what the vector is, and we've just figured out a way to, I would say, consistently generate insects in the lab that carry the pathogen so we can do transmission experiments. So now the idea is once, we set up experiments with X number of insects that we know carry the pathogen, and we expose them to 10 individuals of Bismarck palm, 10 individuals of Phoenix sylvestris, 10 individuals of Christmas palms or whatever species. so that we know we're exposing these plants to the pathogen, and then we quantify the infection rate among the different species, and then we can more definitively say that a palm is more or less susceptible to the disease.
So palms that are not susceptible, do we know if even when they don't show signs, then they don't get sick, if they can still transmit it, the disease, if the plant hopper is going to come and eat from a palm that is not susceptible? Do we know if we can get the disease and go to a Sylvester palm and infect the Sylvester palm?
That's a good question. Right now, we don't have any evidence of any species that can maintain the phytoplasma but not get sick. From what we've seen, every single palm that it has the phytoplasma eventually dies from it. If there is a palm species out there that does harbor the phytoplasma and doesn't get sick, then yes, it can serve as what we call a reservoir. It'll the vector can move it from that plant to another. But my hypothesis is that there aren't any palms that are doing that any palm that gets the phytoplasma is going to die from it. But I am suspicious that there is a grass species that can maintain the phytoplasma in the grass, because the nymphs of Hoplaxius crudus feed on the grass. So that's another area of research we're looking into to determine if there is a species of grass that is serving as a reservoir that will allow for future infections.
So you're talking about the nymph. Obviously, the plant hopper nymphs grow in the grass.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I noticed this too in some kind of fancy hotels, apartment complexes, where pest control companies come in every month or every other month to spray insecticides on the grass. There seems to be less infections of lithobronzing.
Yeah.
What do you think about this?
So a lot of the generic insecticides are going to do a good job at controlling and killing Hoplaxius crudus nymphs. We're doing some experiments now assessing different formulations of imidacloprid in grass and palm seedlings to test the efficacy. But I don't have any doubts that they are effective at controlling. So if you have a strong program targeting using insecticides in grasses or palms, you're probably keeping the vector population down. So it's usually not a risk of the local population that's going to be causing disease in your developed areas. It's the risk of new palms being brought in that have insects that have the pathogen from the nursery, and when they bring them in, they jump off the palms and cause an outbreak in the area. That's, I think, the real risk.
Yeah, and that obviously might be a factor when you have hundreds of palms in a DOT, in a highway, and obviously nobody's spraying insecticides on the grass, and well, we can see the results, right? Let's talk about the symptoms of lithobronzing. There's some early symptoms that people can see with their own eyes that you can tell us, just to pay attention every time we're working on these palms.
Yeah, so the symptoms are a little bit tricky, because we found that the symptoms produced in the palms are a result of the physiological stress that the pathogen exerts on the plant. So any plant, when it's stressed, it usually loses its older leaves first. So what happens is the phytoplasma infects the palm and starts blocking the vascular network. And the first thing that happens is it drops its fruit prematurely, or the inflorescence, the flowers start to rot. That's your first indication. So if you have a big row of Phoenix palms and they all have a nice flower cluster or fruit cluster on them, and then you have one in the middle of it that doesn't have anything, that can be an indicator that you might have a palm infected with phytoplasma. But then after that, the next symptom is the oldest leaves start to die because it's becoming extremely stressed due to the phytoplasma infection. And you get this typical bronze color on the oldest leaves, and that slowly works its way up, or quickly sometimes, into the canopy, affecting younger and younger leaves. So if you ever notice a new planting of a palm, a cabbage palm on the highway, it starts to show what looks like lethal bronzing. It has those bronze colored older leaves right after it's been put in the ground, and that's just stress from the, cutting the roots and moving it until it gets reestablished. So any significant stress on the palm is going to produce those kinds of symptoms. So you kind of have to look at multiple factors. Typically when I see the bronze layer of leaves, but I see like fresh dirt and the braces around the base of the trunk, it's likely that it's just stress from the move, not lethal bronzing.
Another question about that really quick. So this plant hopper, it's a piercing sucking insect.
Yes.
Right? We usually see this, that I don't know if all of them, but most of the piercing sucking insects produce honeydew, that produce sudimol. So do these plant hopper produce honeydew so we can see the black spots on the leaves, and we probably gonna see the activity of these insects before the symptoms start showing?
So probably not, because typically the sooty mold is observed when you're dealing with scales and mealybugs and you have a really high density of insects clustered in a single spot, and they have lots and lots of honeydew coming out. Then you get it. Generally the number of individuals of Crudis that you're going to see on a palm are not going to be high enough to really accumulate that much honeydew, and they're not as strong of feeders as scales and mealybugs. So that's, unfortunately, there's really no way to look at a palm and say, oh, the insect is there. Yeah.
The bugs are active. Well, we have some questions. Tanya, can you read some of the questions, please?
Absolutely, thank you. I think some of the questions kind of touch a little bit, but some of the questions we got from Angelo at Ferrovial. He's asking, will injecting in a different location every time can cause any other issues? And related to that, does injecting insecticide have any effect on the vector prevention to avoid the vector jumping to those plants?
Okay. So with regard to injecting in different locations and causing other issues, I think it's possible that it can open up a wound for a fungal infection. I've never seen that or experienced that in my experiments or what I've been doing, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. I don't know how much of a risk it is. So generally we recommend plugging up the hole. In the past, if people have used the same site for injections, so they just leave the septa in there. But since we're kind of trying to get away from using the same injection site, basically removing the septa and plugging it up with like a dowel rod, the same diameter of the hole, can maybe somewhat help mitigate any negative effects from either fungus or an insect. But again, I haven't seen anything that makes it that big of a concern, but I'm not saying that there's no risk either. Then, all right, so the next question looks like having 4 locations in 1 year, and rotating. So the problem with rotating back around and using, again, those same sites is once you drill into the palm, you're disrupting that living tissue. So immediately there's still enough activity to inject and uptake your first injection. Then pretty soon after that, that tissue is going to dry up and die. So anything you're injecting, whether at the next quarter or a year, is probably not going to be taken up at all, or if it does, it's going to be in very, very small amounts. That's going to give you less return on the investment. So unfortunately, it would need to be a new hole every time, and I know over a long period of time that's going to make a rather unsightly tree, but it's unfortunately that's the nature of the scenario. Now, I've heard of products that combine insecticides, and that question is about the insecticides preventing the vector from moving to adjacent palms. So early on, I didn't have data or any information. I didn't want to, plug a certain strategy without the supporting information. But we do have some data now that indicates that the vector needs around 5 days to a week to acquire the pathogen. We still don't know how long it takes to inject enough phytoplasma to cause an infection, but I'd be willing to bet that it's going to take a similar amount of time of feeding. Now, based on some of our preliminary data with insecticide trials, it seems like using a systemic insecticide, if it's present in the leaf tissue when the vector's feeding, it looks like it will kill the bug before it can acquire the phytoplasma and possibly kill it before it could infect it. So at this point, I do think having an insecticide in the palms also is going to be effective in not only vector management, but possibly disease management. But having the OTC as kind of a backup for prevention, I think is a good strategy. Then there's the question about the OTC traveling upwards from the injection site. So this is one of the reasons why I think getting a curative treatment is going to be difficult, because even if we inject a high concentration and a high volume of OTC a foot above the ground, yes, you're eradicating the phytoplasma from that point up. But if it's still sitting down in the roots, we're not able to get to that. So part of what I'm trying to do is see if there's a way to deliver the phytoplasma into the roots, either through an injection well below the soil line, or potentially as sort of a like mixing it with water in a very, very diluted amount so that it can get taken up into the plant and kill everything from the roots up. So that's something that I'm interested in doing, but like I said, I don't have funding for that, and the funding I have, I see the vector control to be absolutely critical for bringing this disease under control in the nurseries. And then if we can get something going with OTC as like an emergency plan, where let's say you have a palm that is, I got a picture of some dying Sylvestris in a hotel along the beach, and the hotel was like 20 stories in a big U shape. So the only way you're getting that palm out of there is, with a helicopter. So there's certain circumstances where it may be more cost effective to spend extra to try and cure the palm with OTC than to actually remove it and replace it. So it's on my radar, but it's the vector portion is going to be priority. But yes, for a curative treatment with OTC, I think it's going to have to involve the roots in some way.
Perfect. Question, when you're talking about insecticides, usually, we inject to the palms and trees imidacloprid, right? That's the insecticide that you recommend to be injected to the palms on areas that the disease is kind of active?
Yes, my imidacloprid is it does very well against plant hoppers, especially phloem feeders, especially if the insecticide is systemic, and that's what we're using in our preliminary trials. And I've worked with it before in grapes with mealybugs. That's how we kept our plants clean. And my wife jokes that my answer to everything at home in the yard is put imidacloprid.
So, Dr. Ryan Bader, how can we help you with your research? What can we do to help you with your work? Let's talk about funding. What kind of issues you have right now?
Well, when I was hired, I was told that getting money and funding for research in palms is difficult. Now I feel like I've done okay, but the severity of this disease, unfortunately, with what I've gotten, it's, we are making advances, we're learning, we're advancing, but I'm at this cusp where getting some extra funding really to hire somebody completely focused on developing the management strategies in the nursery for the vector is really going to push us over the top to give a solid recommendation to everyone, saying this is what you need to do when to bring this vector population under control. So, I've gotten some decent sized grants from the ISA Florida chapter. FNGLA has been very supportive. National Horticultural Foundation has been good. I've gotten some federal grants as well. But it got me thinking, palms are predominantly a Florida issue, where we have a lot of ornamental, and here in Florida, they're ornamentals. They're not an agricultural commodity. So because it's restricted to Florida and it's an ornamental, it doesn't have the same level of commodity support that something like strawberries does, or out west where they have grapes and hops. They have these large organizations that have grants for research in these crops to improve production and yield. So I know it's not, the industry is not huge. It's a big industry in Florida, but it's to have that level of funding. I understand that it just doesn't exist. But it got me thinking, I've had a few nurseries or landscaping companies who've been very gracious to, they say, oh, we want to donate and help the research. And it got me thinking that, organizing some sort of effort where, I don't know how many nurseries and landscaping companies there are in Florida. I imagine there's quite a bit. But, the UF does accept, these types of donations for our research program. So setting up something where, a little bit from each company can add enough funding especially unrestricted funding. And that's one of my biggest issues with these grants, is that I need, the grants are for a year and then they expire. And, you know, getting somebody in and trained takes time. And by the time they're good to go, the grant's over and there's no guarantee of getting it. So having that unrestricted funding can really help get somebody in, trained, and push this research to the next level, to where we're really going to start seeing some results.
Yeah, right now, we know that removing and injecting pumps is not 100% effective.
Yeah.
So what we have is your research, doctor. So I would like to invite everybody that wants to, you know, get in contact with me or Dr. Brian Bader and wants to help to research about this disease a little bit more and try to get it under control in Florida. Just contact me, contact Dr. Brian Bader, and we can work with you and we can see. I know some companies have nonprofits foundings every year. They just, you know, they just give money to nonprofit organizations. Maybe we can make something work. And I would like to invite everybody to just support Dr. Brian Bader. And well, I believe that's the only way we're gonna try to, you know, at least slow down this disease or control it, because right now we're struggling. It's everywhere. I can see it on the neighborhoods. I can see it on the highways. I can see it everywhere. And it looks like it's out of control. Yeah. So doctor, hopefully we can, with these webinars, we can just start supporting your work. And
the other important thing to consider is, you know, the vector of lethal yellowing and lethal bronzing is the same. And this is the second time Florida's experienced the phytoplasma introduction into the state, causing severe economic losses. As history tells us, it will happen again. So getting the research done now and understanding it now, yeah, we can mitigate the effects of lethal bronzing. But if we have this framework of knowledge in place, we're going to be ready. So this doesn't become an issue again in the future. So if when another phytoplasma gets introduced, we already know more or less what insect is causing it and how to control it, so we can stop it before it gets to the levels of what we're seeing.
Exactly. As you mentioned, lethal yellowing, it's completely under control right now. So why we cannot control lethal bronzing is basically the same kind of disease. And I believe we have a lot of possibilities to get it under control. The only problem is obviously if you don't have funds, you cannot make your research. Yeah. And we're not going to get to that point. Yeah. So thank you very much, Dr. Brian. I think we're almost done with the webinar. It was great. Thank you very much for your help. Thank you very much for your support. And everybody who works with me, and I do tests for lethal bronzing, Dr. Brian is the one that is getting done for us. So thank you very much, doctor, for your work. And well, hopefully we can make this work.
Thank you, Sergio. And thank you everybody for listening.